Sherlock Holmes. Who wouldn't know Sherlock Holmes? His presence in literature and media is practically inescapable, especially in the detective genre, which he basically represents, together with the three objects: a magnifying glass, a pipe, and a deerstalker hat. A funny thing is that no story by Arthur Conan Doyle actually mentions a deerstalker specifically. It was the illustrator Sidney Paget who gave him the specific hat, as he was often wearing it himself, and it became a very iconic thing over time. It kinda shows how Sherlock as a character is sort of living life on his own outside of the books. And well, some of the iconic stuff actually was added later by other people.
But how do you know about them?
Elementary, my dear Watson.
Anyway, today you can just put the picture of magnifying glass next to a shelf in library to mark the detective genre. And the shelf is going to be full of Nesbo, because that man just can't stop writing. I would say that the magnifying glass being the symbol of detective genre now is one of the best evidence of how influential the work of Arthur Conan Doyle is. And Sherlock Holmes until this day is still everywhere. There are many inspired stories, references, kids' books and puzzles with him, and he is still reappearing across all kinds of media. Also since 2023, Sherlock Holmes has been completely free of copyright laws, so yeah, your Sherlock and Watson fanfictions are now legal to publish. Yay! So Sherlock Holmes stories practically changed the whole detective genre, and the influence can be seen everywhere. That is nothing new. But I was curious, since Sherlock Holmes has a modern adaptations and so many detective books and movies are influenced by him, what it's like to read the original stories. Can they still be interesting for a modern reader? Especially when so many of the same tropes could be seen somewhere else? And I also wonder, what are the canon accurate Holmes and Watson like? Those are some of my questions for this review of the first two novels, A Study in Scarlet from 1887 and The Sign of Four from 1890. So, let's talk about Study in Scarlet, the first appearance of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson. It is also the first time the characters meet each other. At the start of the story, Watson is living in London after he was sent home from the Second Afghani War because of his injuries. He is searching for a new place to live, and thanks to advice of his acquaintance, he ends up living together with Sherlock Holmes in 221p Baker Street.
And they were roommates.
Oh my god, they were roommates.
Well, technically they were flatmates, but whatever. Watson quickly finds out that his new friend is a bit of an unusual fellow, and that he plays around with chemicals and also works as a consulting detective. And eventually unusual murder mystery shows up. Holmes invites Watson to go with him to investigate the crime scene, and that's how the years of solving mysteries together start. Well, usually Holmes is the one solving the mysteries, while Watson sort of tags along and then writes down the most unique cases. But yeah, they are chasing the criminals together. So, what do I think about it? It is a short novel and can be read quite quickly once you get used to the older language. I have to admit I was a bit struggling. I started to read the novel in Czech language and I was immediately pulled in, but after a few chapters I switched to English because I bought this really pretty book that contains most of Sherlock Holmes stories. I mean, okay, it used to look cute when I bought it, yeah. So yeah, I was reading it in English, and yeah, since English is not my first language, I was a bit struggling. I also learned some new words, like for example the word act, which means to get something with great difficulty. Anyway, there are also some interesting phrases like simple, I ejaculated. Okay, perhaps you could have kept this to yourself, Watson? Also, do I have the right book? Am I not at AO3? No? Okay, sure, good. And I'm not even mentioning the word queer, because I think the second meaning is well known. Yeah, but really, it's probably better to read the novel close to a translator or dictionary. But once you get used to the language, I don't see much of a problem here. I guess it can discourage some new readers, but personally, I actually enjoyed the older English. It's very colorful and adds a certain charm to the story. Also, I love how everyone is like so dramatic. I mean, how else would I know the situation is serious if no one exclaimed or cried, "Good heavens, the Lord be thanked, thousands apologies." Or, "The young canting rascals," he exclaimed, whipping the perspiration from his forehead. "I would sooner see you in your grave, my girl, than the wife of either of them." Yeah, very dramatic. I love it. And we would miss Holmes's increasingly familiar way of addressing Watson that goes from doctor to "my dear Watson," "my dear doctor," "old chap," "my Watson," and all kinds of other expressions. Honestly, I find it really weird to hear them actually call each other by their first names in the modern adaptations. Am I the only one? But the language is part of the charm, so I encourage everyone to give it a try themselves, even if I have to admit I was a bit lost because of it, so perhaps try to look for a version with dictionary in the back of the book, so you can find out what are words like act. I don't know why, but for some reason that word really stayed with me. But even though the language is older, the writing style is not boring at all. It's very energetic and plot-driven. It does not waste time on unnecessary information and jumps between fast-paced dialogues and concise descriptions. The story laser focuses on the mystery, and the timing of each reveal is perfect. At least that's what the first part of the novel is like. That in Scarlet is composed of two parts. The first part is about how Watson met Holmes, how they started living together, and how they discovered their first murder mystery. It also contains the whole investigation, the introduction of Sherlock Holmes as an extraordinary human being that can solve practically anything, and also the capture of the murder. The second part of the book slows down its pace a lot and gives us the backstory of the murder and tells us what everything was leading to it. And the second part of the book is definitely not bad, but after the very hectic first part, it might be a bit of a letdown, and I can imagine some readers might put down the book here and never come back. The second part of the book is also very much about completely different characters, and it happens in America, and the story is just not very original. On the other hand, I don't think that the separation into two parts is a bad idea, and the slowing down makes narratively a lot of sense, because thanks to this the backstory gets its own space. I think I personally quite enjoyed it, but I definitely can see that it's just kind of stereotypical, and I'm not sure, but maybe it was stereotypical even back then, like forced marriage, I mean. Also, the characters in the second half, they are not necessarily bad, but compared to Holmes and Watson, they are not nearly as interesting. Actually, I would say that this novel really stands on Sherlock, because this is the big introduction of his character and his investigation methods. The backstory of the crime is not some novelty, but the investigation definitely is. Arthur Conan Doyle surprised the detective genre with a new way of investigating crimes. Investigation based on logic, rationality, the collection of evidence, using medical and scientific knowledge. He was not the first to use logical and critical thinking as a device to solve crimes, and he had some influence, but he made it popular and a standard for the genre. The problem of detective stories of his time was that very often the crime would be solved by luck or accident, and Doyle had quite a problem with that. A Study in Scarlet is exactly about that. It's about an eccentric genius who shows up with his new methods, and he is eager to prove that he is right. It might be similar to Arthur himself, who showed up with something new in the genre and was trying to prove himself. By the way, even if Sherlock is like a genius, there are parts in these books when Sherlock actually makes a wrong guess or deduction, and it's always really funny to read about him fighting his giant ego. At least that was my first impression. Now looking back at these moments, I think he might just be insecure. He gets nervous when some of his deductions don't go the way he expects, and he immediately starts doubting himself. But he also becomes really happy when his methods work, so yeah. After all, this is the first story, and he's still quite young and not yet the famously brilliant detective he later becomes, so perhaps he's really just insecure about his abilities. I guess this really showed that Doyle was a good writer, because he could handle his character, give him flaws and tone it down when necessary, and give him enough likable moments that he actually became wildly popular instead of insufferable. But back to the book. The first half of the novel is basically an introduction to Sherlock Holmes and his methods of deduction, which he shows and explains to Watson and the audience. The second part is a bit of an old-fashioned tale, but still fairly enjoyable. All in all, I had fun, especially the investigation part aged well, and Watson and Holmes are very enjoyable characters together. Now let's move to The Sign of Four, the second novel. And this one, I don't know, this one is a bit of a mixed bag for me. It had some really cool moments, but personally I felt like I wasn't invested in the story as much as in the first one, or at least not all the time. In general, I think I should read it again someday, because I have to admit I was a bit lost. It might be the struggle with the language and the fact that there are suddenly way more characters. Also, this is just my opinion. I think the story shows the signs of the time it was written more than the first novel does, and it has some elements that haven't aged too well, but I will talk more about that later. Actually, it was this novel that made Arthur Conan Doyle popular. Study in Scarlet was a bit of a flop. So, a lot is definitely happening in this novel. Let's take a look. The story starts in definitely unique fashion. It starts with Sherlock Holmes doing cocaine. Yeah, that's actually how it starts. It's definitely one way to introduce your main character.
What is it tonight? Morphine or cocaine?
I can strongly recommend a 7% solution of cocaine. Would you care to try it?
Watson actually complains about it and warns him that it's dangerous, but Holmes is like, I'm bored and there's no case, so let's do drugs. Actually, cocaine was quite popular in the second half of the 19th century. There was some awareness of the drug's harmful effects. We can see this in Watson, who warns Holmes about using it. However, the drug was still largely underestimated at the time, and Holmes's recreational use was not as unusual as it would be today. But back to the story. The case itself actually starts when a young lady, Mary Morstan, shows up with a problem. Her father disappeared 10 years ago, after he came back to London from India. He was never found, but instead of 4 years later, she started receiving pearls as a gift every year from an unknown person. This was happening until she got an invitation to meet the person in the middle of the night. Both Watson and Holmes join her to meet the mysterious person, and it begins an adventure where they search for hidden Indian treasure, solve a murder done behind locked doors, and have to find and chase multiple culprits through London. So in the first novel, Sherlock deduces solutions from cigarette ashes and footsteps, quite an iconic thing for Sherlock Holmes to do. Well, the story also adds disguises, which became a regular part of his investigation. He can easily change his appearance and search for information among people. And we also find out that he is good at boxing. Compared to the first novel, there is more action in general. Sherlock is climbing roofs, Watson and Sherlock are running around London with Doc following the scent of the criminal, and there's also a chase on a steamboat on the Thames. And now I'm not saying Arthur Conan Doyle invented every trope, he's not the first writer in the genre, but some of the stuff became iconic for his own work, and definitely influenced others. Also, I feel like this novel has a bit of everything. The action, investigation, revenge, even romantic subplot between Watson and Mary Morstan. So yeah, in this novel definitely happens a lot. Yet, as I mentioned, I feel like I was struggling with this one more than the first one. Maybe it was the number of the characters, maybe I was struggling with the language, or maybe I just wasn't that invested in the whole search for Indian treasure. I'm not sure. I mean, searching for treasure from the Orient might not be that original for modern reader, but these are the roots of the genre and we have to keep that in mind. The book still has a lot of atmosphere and there are many singular moments that are fun to read on their own. For example, there's a moment when Holmes deduces everything about the owner of an old watch that Watson shows him. And he guesses everything, their age, financial situation and entire life story. Somehow I feel that these moments where he deduces everything from a random object never get old, even if they are more fantastical than realistic. At least that's the impression I have from this book so far. Sherlock can do and solve everything. As a reader, I just have to wonder how he will do it next time. And now there is something else I'd like to talk about. This book is old. Considering it was written by a white British man in the 19th century, it is kinda safe to assume that some parts did not age well. Yet I have to say I was still surprised by this one racist description. Like, this one is something. It kinda reminds me of those drawn caricatures of African American people, but in a written form. I will read you a bit. It straightened itself into a little black man, the smallest I have ever seen, with a great misshapen head and shock of a tangled disheveled hair. Holmes had already drawn his revolver, and I whipped out mine at the sight of this savage, disordered creature. Creature? This character isn't even considered a person. For most of the time he's described more like an animal. And the description continues. Never have I seen features so deeply marked with all bestiality and cruelty. His small eyes glowed and burned with somber light, and his thick lips were writted back from his teeth, which grinned and chattered at us with half-animal fury. After this part, Holmes takes his revolver and prepares to shoot, and Watson describes it with the following line. I can see the two of them now, as they stood, the white man with his legs far apart, shrieking out curses, and the unhallowed dwarf with his hideous face and his strong yellow teeth, gnashing at us in the light of our lantern. Yeah, that is the description. It's wild. So this poor man described here is a Tonga, a native of the Andaman Islands and one of the bad guys in this story. As you heard, he is not described nicely at all. There's actually one character that is fond of him and considers him a friend, but even he sees him more as a pet or unruly kid at best. And that guy is also a criminal, so that doesn't help. For most of the time, Tonga is described as having a murder and violence in his nature, and also a desire for cannibalism, but he doesn't actually eat anyone, thank God. I wonder how this description came about. I mean, there was nothing unusual about 19th century writer being racist. The public was also racist, but I wonder if Arthur Conan Doyle simply opened the first encyclopedia he found and rewrote what was in it, or if he was trying to exaggerate Tonga's frightening features to build tension. Who knows, it simply might be the typical racism of its time. As I said, this book clearly reflects the time it was written in, so if you decide to read it, keep in mind it was written in the 19th century. But overall, there were many moments and characters I liked, and I was surprised by how funny this book could be at times. Now let's change the topic. The last thing I wanted to talk about is Watson and Holmes, the iconic duo of the detective genre. So Holmes and Watson, Watson and Holmes. They inspired many other Holmeses and Watsons, like Poirot and Hastings for example, and established that almost every detective needs their partner, or sidekick, or someone. But once again, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was inspired by earlier works in the genre. The first person to introduce a brilliant detective with their friend documenting their actions was actually Edgar Allan Poe. In his short stories, we met C. Auguste Dupin, who solves unusual mysteries, and his actions are recorded by an unnamed narrator, who is often amazed by his abilities and accompanies him during the story. Now Doyle just made his detective even more brilliant, gave a name to the narrator, and hey, an iconic duo is here. And now we can find many portrayals of Holmes and Watson in all kinds of adaptations. Some of them are closer to the originals, some of them are more vaguely inspired. But now let's look at the original Watson and Holmes in the first two novels. As I mentioned, the genius idea of telling a detective story from the perspective of someone other than the detective himself comes from Poe. It's a very effective narrative choice, since the distance from the detective's mind allows the reader to be more easily surprised and impressed by his abilities. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle took this idea further and perfected it by using an unreliable narrator, Watson. He could present us with the greatest detective ever, at least as long as we trust Watson's judgment. The contrast between their characters is also important. Watson is definitely more relatable character for the average reader. He's kind, curious and intelligent, but not as brilliant as Sherlock, who stands in strong contrast to him. Holmes is described as cold, analytical and sometimes almost narcissistic. But most importantly, he's a genius when it comes to solving a crime. At least that's how Watson sees him, and that's how we come to see him too. There's a parallel between the reader and the narrator, since neither can see into the detective's mind and both are left in the dark until the detective sheds some light into the situation. And Watson is quite often left in the dark about what's happening until Holmes finally explains everything to him, or the criminal is captured. The readers find themselves in the same position. We don't know what's going on until the dramatic reveal, which is usually accompanied by Watson's amazement. Another thing that contributes to this effect is that Holmes actually likes dramatic reveals, so yeah, these two really work well together. I also feel like the best way to portray genius in any kind of story is by not showing their inner thoughts, but by describing them through the perspective of others. The moment you make them too relatable or reveal how they think, part of the mystery is gone. But of course, unlike Poe's Dupin stories, Watson isn't just a nameless narrator who tells the story, he is his own character as well as a friend, flatmate and partner in adventures. And that creates a much more fun dynamic. Personally, I have to say that many of my favorite moments in the books are the interactions between these two. I especially love their first meeting, which is iconic and shows that they are both very curious people. So before Watson meets Holmes for a first time, he gets warned by his friend that Holmes is kinda weird. When they actually meet, it's in hospital, and Sherlock is working on some sort of experiment, and his reaction to Watson is like, "Oh, you were in Afghanistan. Anyway, here's my science project." Basically, he does the bare minimum of social courtesy and immediately switches to talking about his interest. Sometimes I kinda wonder if he's autistic. Anyway, he's actually really excited to show Watson what he's working on. "Come over here now," he seized me by the coat sleeve in his eagerness and drew me over to the table at which he had been working. Now there's also this line that I love. "Haha," he cried, clapping his hands and looking as delighted as a child with a new toy. "What do you think of that?" Well, of course, Watson, being Watson, is genuinely impressed and congratulates him, but it seems he is more surprised by his enthusiasm than his discovery. After that, there's a bit of a cross-examination where they share their worst habits and come to the conclusion that they want to live together. At the end, we find out that Watson is actually really curious about his new friend. It's not just, "Oh, this is a random guy I'm going to live with," but he's genuinely invested in finding out more about Sherlock. "By the way," I asked suddenly, stopping and turning upon Stamford, "how the deuce did he know that I had come from Afghanistan?" "That's just his little peculiarity," he said. "A good many people have wanted to know how he finds things out." "Oh, a mystery, is it?" I cried, rubbing my hands. "This is very piquant. I'm much obliged to you for bringing us together. The proper study of a mankind is a man, you know? "You must study him then," Stamford said, as he bade me goodbye. "You will find him a knotty problem, though. I will wager he learns more about you than you about him." "Goodbye," I answered, and strolled onto my hotel, considerably interested in my new acquaintance. So yeah, Watson basically realized that Sherlock Holmes is actually a really strange guy, but he's more into good than anything else, which I think sums up their relationship rather well. In general, Holmes studies cases, while Watson studies Holmes. I mean, Watson loves to give us long descriptions of him. But of course, most importantly, they both share a love for mystery and adventure. There is also one other thing about Sherlock Holmes. Watson describes him as a cold, unemotional, almost egoistical, but I actually thought he was surprisingly kind at times. "Look here, Watson, you look regularly done. Lie down there on the sofa and see if I can put you to sleep." He took up his violin from the corner, and as I stretched myself out, he began to play some low, dreamy, melodious air, his own, no doubt, for he had a remarkable gift for improvisation. I mean, what in a bromance? Like, I'm starting to understand why AO3 loves them so much. By the way, this is how the official introduction describes them in my book. The reader who holds this volume in his hands, and who also is about to experience for the first time the adventures contained herein, occupies an enviable position. In a study in Scarlet, he will discover Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson in the flesh of a youth, shyly and curiously learning each other's secrets like a honeymooning couple as they embark upon a lifetime of intrigue and danger. God damn it, even the official introduction thinks they are gay. So, as I already said, the influence of Sherlock Holmes is huge, and it did reach many other books and movies. So technically this wasn't my first time meeting with the Sherlock and Watson type of dynamic. I never saw any of the popular adaptations of Sherlock Holmes, but I kinda met with them through other stories. For example, some years ago I read The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, where the protagonist is William of Baskerville, who is to some degree based on Holmes, and it's not even secret, I mean the last name is direct reference. And William of Baskerville is followed everywhere by his student Atzo, who is sort of his Watson. Except their relationship is more of a teacher and student like, so that's quite different. But I love these two, and the book is one of my favorites, so it was really interesting to finally read where the author took inspiration from. Also, I remember as a kid watching this Tom and Jerry movie where Watson and Holmes made an appearance. Actually, I completely forgot about it until I started reading Study in Scarlet, and I was like, wait a minute, I do remember some movie with them. But to be honest, as a kid I was more distracted by the fact that this lady is for some reason half naked. There is also a Czech movie called Adéla ještě nevečerila, which I saw like hundreds of times as a kid, and it is a parody of older detective novels. The main character is this brilliant detective from America, both smart and strong, good at boxing. He's practically good at everything, really. I mean, look, he just beats Phantomas. He can also speak almost any language on Earth, and if he can't, he just learns it on the train before arriving in the country where he needs it. He also has his unbeatable nemesis, and during the movie he's accompanied by Commissar Ledvina, who is basically his Watson, and whose methods are simpler but more practical.
Moment.
Děkuji.
One thing I realized is that it's practically impossible to escape Sherlock Holmes anywhere. Sherlock Holmes has become one of the most recognizable figures in pop culture, like the monster from Frankenstein or Dracula. An interesting thing is how different he is from his actual literary counterpart. I don't think he is as cold as he is often portrayed. But after reading these two books, I feel like I see Doyle's influence everywhere in the genre, and even outside of it. But who knows, maybe I'm just seeing things.
Everywhere I go, I see his face.
It seems to me that Doyle created a sort of a world of his own in his Sherlock Holmes stories, a world with its own rules and a certain story structure that is easily adopted and applied elsewhere. Of course, that doesn't mean Doyle's writing style would be easy to imitate. It's just very influential. So if you are a fan of the genre, I think you should read it. They are classics for a reason. And I'm personally definitely looking forward to read the rest of his stories. And that's all from me today. Bye!